Within the last possible fraction of a second, James managed to restrain the pressure of his mechanical grip before he would crush his own foam by clenching shut, as his brain short-circuited from what it had to hear. His synapses fired wildly to get all kinds of reactions out of him, although they ultimately achieved the exact opposite, as all the calls to action cancelled each other out in his head, causing him to freeze up, with the exception of his clenching fists and teeth. And before he could fully get a grip, his interlocutor was already speaking up again, keeping that exact same polite yet stinging tone that he had used during his introduction. I take it from your heavy breathing that you are currently wondering just why you would care about anything I have to say, and I can't say that I don't understand your skepticism. Alexander's voice explained through the speakers of the phone, and James could basically see the blonde man's picture drawing shapes into the air with his fingers in front of his inner eye as he spoke. But I think you might find that burying the hatchet for just a moment here could prove quite beneficial to the both of us. James grimaced. Although a large number of his neurons were still tugging for him to shut down again, as they wished to maneuver him back onto a kill course, he managed to keep himself just about in check enough to not waste any opportunity that this conversation may have provided, even if everything within him resisted against the idea of seeing the young man as anything but a stain to be wiped away at this point. They may have never directly clashed with each other so far. Hell, he had barely even exchanged 3 words with the man. But that didn't erase everything the two of them knew about each other by their actions and reputations alone. To the both of us, James pressed out through the twitching corners of his lips, as his face morphed into an aggressive snarl that was unseen by anybody. Why would I be interested in anything that is even remotely beneficial to you? He could hear a chuckle coming from Alexander, and although it seemed genuine, James could pick up a hint of nervousness waiting just underneath it. Wow, that is an angry tone, the younger man brought out between humorous exhales. Gives me the shivers. I mean, I already got goosebumps from watching you give your speeches on screen, but getting hit by all of that directly is an entirely different world. James's expression darkened even more, partly because of anger at Alexander's laughing. However, a bigger part was a moment of hesitation, as he wondered how serious the guide was being, because once again, what he said sounded genuine. However, if it was, James had to wonder just why Alexander would be so upfront about the fact that James's presence affected him so much. But to answer your question, Alexander meanwhile continued, catching himself after his brief, humorous outburst. How about you listen to me first, and then decide if what you will get out of it is worth doing me just the tiniest favor in the process. Like I said, it is something that should interest the both of us, and therefore you can probably imagine that it's not going to be something that would go against your sensibilities. A nice idea, really. However, no matter what was about to follow, James highly doubted that it would be the full story. In fact, the more Alexander insisted that there was nothing going on that James would disapprove of, the more James had to suspect that there was a hook in this bait. Obviously so. So obviously that Alexander had to know it as well. Right? Maybe he was trying to goad him. Some more of his mental capacities slowly returned to James, the more suspicious of the situation grew. It was honestly a miracle that he could still get more suspicious of Alexander than he already was. But here they were. As he kept the conversation going, James slowly began to stand, pushing himself from the pile he had been resting on for the last who knew how long to slowly and quietly make his way to the door. Admittedly, he didn't quite know why he was trying to sneak around here. Logically speaking, it was unlikely that Alexander gave a rat's ass about him moving around, or being overheard as they talked. Maybe it was just a vague, childish urge to keep the upper hand on James's side that caused him to act in such a manner. If it's not against my sensibilities, then how in the world would it benefit you? He asked, as he moved towards the door leading out of the bathroom. Admittedly, it was basically the same thing he had already asked, and really only served as filler to keep the conversation flowing while he repositioned. By anointing me as a saint, you as the guide have already declared everything I do as a misguided to evil attempt to pull everyone into the abyss with me. Isn't that right?" Alexander exhaled audibly through his nose, though it didn't sound quite as amused as his earlier chuckle. It also didn't sound angry or annoyed. If James had to put a name to it, he would have said that it sounded validated. "I have to say, there is a big difference between vaguely knowing that you once followed the teachings of the church and hearing you actually understand them. Calling you misguided will be doing you an injustice, Saint," Alexander returned, luckily taking James's bait of just talking now that his beliefs had been pulled into the mix. "You know the right path, and you have willingly stepped off it. I don't know if I would call that evil, but it is certainly dangerous. Many have held this title before you, but I have to admit that you, Aldwin, are the very model of a saint." Despite the fact that being a saint was by no means anything good in the Church of the Failed Saviour's beliefs, and especially not in the specific branch that Alexander was a dignitary of, the guy's voice did carry an air of reverence as he reaffirmed James's title to himself. Almost as if he had never expected to truly meet someone that would fit his own worldview so perfectly one day. By now, the bathroom door had opened for James, and he was slowly stepping out into his cell's main room. Sheeda was laying sprawled out on the bed, and it looked like she had been dozing off for quite a while there. However, her ears still twitched as she heard the door and his footsteps, and soon enough her head raised slightly to look at him with an expression that wasn't sure if it wanted to be curious or suspicious yet. Indicating for her to please be quiet with a gesture, James removed his phone from his ear and put it onto loudspeaker so she could listen to the conversation along with him. "Only if we go by your church's very specific definition of one," he replied to Alexander's questionable praise, as he slowly joined up with his girlfriend, hoping she would catch up to speed with what was going on relatively quickly by just listening. "There certainly are shiploads worth of people ready to disagree and debate with you on that topic." A single scoffing laugh came out of the speakers. "Oh, most certainly," Alexander agreed with James's words without hesitation. "But I did not call you for theological musings. I am calling because of a certain problem that we probably both want out of this world." At the sound of Alexander's voice, Sheeda's ears twitched even more before erecting straight up. Her gaze got much sharper as her yellow eyes zeroed in on the phone in James's hand, and her tail began to swing in wide, extensive motions. "I doubt I'll want anything that's giving you trouble out of this world," James replied, though inwardly he was kicking himself for still going down that same path of just questioning everything Alexander was saying. Eloquence this really wasn't. Alexander let out a quiet sigh that sounded like he was leaning his head away from the microphone for it. "No matter how far our opinions may split, at the end of the day, we are both still human, aren't we? It would figure that we also have the same troubles here and there, based on our heritage alone." He responded to James's questioning in a tone that was so violently diplomatic that politicians would have called it fake. And James would know. He was one at this point. "And since you know about our teachings, you know it is my duty as a guide to keep people on the safest path available. Believe me or not if you want, but the safest path rarely leads right through plunging our people into a massive war. And as much as you are an adversary from my personal point of view, it is a simple fact that a majority of our people will not simply take threats to your safety lying down." James lifted an eyebrow. "So you're worried that something might happen to me and that war will break out over it?" He wondered aloud, now really wondering where Alexander would go with this. After all, if James was worried about anyone trying to cause something to happen to him, Alexander was pretty up there on that list. Alexander was quiet for a moment, but for some reason James imagined him nodding during it. "It's not really hard to surmise that we are sitting on a powder keg, especially after the latest event that has taken place. And although your unfathomably reckless actions somehow managed to graze just past a declaration of war, for the time being at least, it is unquestionable that another push would be the spark that is needed to make it all go up in flames. No matter anyone's opinions on you or your actions, It is unquestionable that your death or serious enough injury would be such a push at this time, he elaborated, obviously doing his best to make his explanations as colourful as he could. I can guide my people away from the footsteps of a saint. I cannot guide them away from an entire galaxy plunged into war. Since he was done with his earlier stalling now, James quickly started to grow tired of these endless dissipations, even if he was self-admittedly guilty of them in many cases himself. Fine, I get it. You are sure that I want to hear it, so get to the point, he therefore said, and briefly glanced up at Sheeda during the sentence. She nodded back at him, slowly, and quickly had her own phone in her hand to additionally record what was going on, now that things would presumably become interesting. The eye roll was basically audible in Alexander's voice as he cleared his throat, and apparently decided to not argue with James on that point. Well, I admittedly didn't expect that I would have to make this call, but since it seems that you have softened up a bit since your jungle-crawling days, I would like to give you a chance to clean up the mess that you have left behind, he explained, still not quite getting to the point yet. However, while Sheeda lifted her eyebrow in slight confusion as to what exactly the man was referring to, James's own face darkened even more than it already had, as a brief picture of blood and gore on a muddy ground flashed through his mind. Inadvertently, his shoulder began to hurt. Any comment he wanted to make about it got stuck in his throat, as he desperately resisted losing his temper at the man. It wasn't out of any misguided sense of undeserved politeness. Fact was, with that sentence alone, Alexander had confirmed for James that lives were on the line here. And even if a part inside of him violently roared up with his own murderous intentions, as it understood where this was going, the larger part of him refused to give in to that bloodlust, now that it hadn't been pushed back into the recesses of his mind. Taking his silence as a sign to keep going, Alexander didn't waste too much time before he continued with his point. Due to our differences with each other, it seems that your opposition has come to the incorrect conclusion that I, as their enemy's enemy, would therefore be on their side. Because of that costly misjudgment, they have sought contact with me after you allowed them to slip away from you with minimal losses, seeking for my support in getting their leader out of your grasp, ideally while also finishing the job in getting you out of the picture. He recounted events from his perspective. If anything of what he was saying was true, then James had no doubt that the rogue Miat soldiers actually had very good reasons to assume that Alexander would aid them if they got in contact with him. However, he also didn't assume that Alexander would be daft enough to admit that outright, even if James were to confront him on it. Luckily for you, I have no intention to follow Mamon's greed and bite off more than I can chew here. If they aren't happy about having gotten away with their lives, then I am all too happy to lead them right back to their doom. They are hiding in a little-known underground area of an abandoned theatre on the Thirifrisu Lane. Excuse me if I butchered that. The Khoivery language is quite hard to replicate. I will make sure you will get the name in writing as well. James's jaw twitched as Alexander dropped the information on him so unceremoniously. You're talking like you're expecting me to exterminate them. He couldn't help but comment to the guide's words. Aren't you? Alexander's words gave back almost immediately, in a deadpan tone. It almost sounded like he had just asked James if Earth's sky is blue. James noticed Sheeda glancing up at him with a worried expression, but a sting that went through him forced him to quickly look away. Very obviously, I am not some mindless killer, he insisted forcefully, maybe belaboring his point a bit more than was appropriate here, as he felt himself getting a bit defensive. And besides, aren't you supposed to very specifically guide people away from danger? Alexander made a slightly amused hum sound that was like the audible version of a wide grin. It is my duty to guide my people away from danger, Saint. Those felines clearly aren't my people, are they? He said at first, before his voice dropped slightly to a flatter tone, as he tagged onto that. After all, it was we who were made in God's image, and not them, wasn't it? James's mouth hung open for a moment, too stunned to reply to that. And although Sheeda had very little context for that reference, she too seemed to be taken aback by the man's words, as silence took hold over the room for a couple of seconds, during which neither of them knew how to reply to such a blatant statement. Though then, the silence was broken again as Alexander audibly cracked up. At first it was just the sound of heavily suppressed snickering that squeezed itself out of clenched lips, but soon enough it fully broke into a hearty laughter that filled the entire room as it came out of the phone speakers. "I got with that one, didn't I?" Alexander happily announced, still occasionally interrupted by hardly suppressed laughter as he fought to regain control over his breath. Eventually he let out one last long, amused exhale as he began to speak with more firmness again. No, sorry to say, but I am not quite that fanatical. But can you imagine?" He broke into another, though much briefer, chuckle, which left James some time to still be baffled by the insinuation, even if it had, apparently, and hopefully, turned out to be a joke. With another exhale, Alexander finished his explanation. "No, it's nothing quite so biblical. Much simpler, in fact. If I want to keep people safe, I cannot let the quite obviously dangerous people run free, if I can do something about it, can I?" He elaborated his self-proclaimed motivations. "These people need to go. You want them gone. I tell you where they are, and the problem solves itself. Simple, isn't it?" James grit his teeth, and in a moment of childish rebelliousness, he couldn't help but rebuff him with, "And what if I'm not going to play along with that?" Obviously, Alexander was unimpressed, and let wanted criminals just run around, especially after what they were compliant to. "Yeah, I don't think you will," he said, in the most confident statement he had made so far. "Kill them, or don't. It doesn't matter to me, as long as you get them off the streets, and do not get yourself killed by their hands. They are nothing but a liability, failed at their oh-so-important mission, and managed to get an innocent hurt in the process. Oh well, innocent." It seemed that the man couldn't help but mock the failed assassins, due to a sadistic need to feel superior. However, James couldn't quite make use of that weakness, because his vision flashed red at the sound of his last words, causing him to interrupt Alexander, and he growled, "One more word out of you and I'll..." However, two could play that game, as Alexander was quick to finish his sentence for him. "Rip out my tongue? I'm sure you would," he said, in a mixture of mockery and frighteningly real honesty. "I have no doubt that if we ever came to blows, I would come out short. I have no delusions about ever coming face to face with you. I'm not even sure I would trust a panel of tempered class between us, which is why I shall bid you goodbye now. As thrilling as it is, this much adrenaline isn't good for my heart. God be with ye, Saint Aldwyn." With that, he hung up without waiting for an answer. In a brief surge of "we're done when I say we're done" energy, James almost moved to immediately call back the number in an attempt to drag Alexander back into this talk, but luckily, rationality prevailed this time. Obviously, the man would just mute his phone or block James's number and move on with his day. "He's really selling them out?" Sheeda's voice suddenly asked into the emerging silence, causing James to snap up to look at her. Sheeda's face was scrunched up in a mixture of thought and worry, intensifying the scars on her face as they popped out against the creases in her skin. "There's got to be more to it than that," James said and shook his head. It didn't make sense. Even if Alexander just wanted to get rid of unloved toys, surely he could be doing that without involving them in the matter, right? Was it maybe so simple that he wanted to make sure that they were linked to the following arrest of the soldiers, before they were going to meet an unfortunate end? After all, last time a political opposition of James who knew a bit too much had been taken into custody, it had ultimately not ended well for them. And there was no way Alexander wanted the felines to be caught alive and well, so they could spill all the secrets they were certainly privy to. But that was way too clumsy of an attempt, wasn't it? Like, he wouldn't risk tipping James off to those intentions just for the small chance he would be dumb enough to fall for it. Would he? A claustrophobic feeling was slowly starting to take hold of him, as his thoughts started to circle around each other. Maybe this was exactly what Alexander wanted, to just make him go crazy with doubts. No way. This was way too much effort for that. Once again, Shida interrupted his thoughts as she let out a deep sigh. "Well, he's right with one thing," she said, and ran a hand over her ear a couple of times to calm herself. "No matter what his intentions are, those people are still out there, and they are still dangerous. We can't just let them run around if we have a chance to put them under lock and key." James laboriously forced himself to swallow his circling thoughts, and gave a firm nod. "Yeah, you're right," he said, with a finality that was mostly meant to convince himself before more doubts could set in. "We can't start to not arrest criminals just because our opposition wants us to. We can't let them dictate our actions like that." Although he repeated the point to really make it sink in for himself, he was still stuck in hesitation for a moment as he stared down at his phone. His finger simply refused to move, even as his brain tried to command it to make the important call. After a couple of seconds of watching him freeze up, Shida cleared her throat. "Do you want me to?" she offered, and James almost immediately released a gallon of air from his lungs that he hadn't even realized he was holding. "Yes, please," he said, and quickly handed his phone over before he could freeze up again. In the meantime, his phone had already gone into standby, but Shida wasn't stopped by that, as she quickly unlocked it and moved to the contacts. James frowned slightly as he watched it, since an insistent thought entered his mind at the sigh. "Hey, He spoke up while Shida searched for the right contact, not being able to suppress it as he asked, "Why didn't you put my phone on silent earlier?" Now it was Shida's turn to freeze up in her movement, as if her finger got stuck to the screen for a moment. Slowly, she lifted her gaze and looked directly into James's eyes. "I have no idea," she admitted, in a tone that indicated that the simple solution had well and truly never occurred to her, while she was being tormented by the phone's constant buzzing. Right after that confession, she lowered her gaze again to continue making the call. Meanwhile, with his intrusive thought out of the way, James used the time to think, since he had no need to listen closely to Shida as she recounted the recent events for the higher-ups. In a way, James suddenly understood what Curie so often felt like when their mind got stuck on a specific problem so firmly that they couldn't even move. He had to figure out what the intention behind Alexander's action was. He couldn't rest before it. Not only for himself or the Miet soldiers, but to ensure that it wouldn't endanger everyone around him. Nia had already gotten hurt. He couldn't allow that to happen to anyone else. Or, much worse, for her too. His brain refused to even finish that thought, as he clenched his eyes shut and lifted his hand to hit against the side of his head, trying to force it to think better through percussive maintenance. He was sure he could figure it out. He just had to think. However, after just 2 hits, his wrist was suddenly grabbed by a firm hand, keeping it from hitting himself even more. Looking up, he saw Shida with her free hand reach out and clasp around his arm, although she didn't actively look at him as she kept listening to whatever instructions for the situation came from the other side. Her face looked stern and determined, and she quietly nodded along with what she was told at that moment. "Understood, ma'am," she then finally said, with one last nod before hanging up. Only once she had put the phone down did she look at James's face while still holding his arm. Once she made eye contact, she tossed his phone back over to him in a highly telegraphed motion, allowing him to catch it quite easily. He looked down at it first, before lifting his gaze to confusedly look back at Shida. The feline nodded at him. "We've got some more calls to make." James stared down at his hands as the guards once again closed the shackles around his arm, securing him to the large bed that Nia was still sleeping on. "Press the button if anything's wrong," one of them reminded him. Then they both already left the room again. James waited for a bit after they left. Quietly, he kept staring down, and he listened out for anything that might happen outside of the room. The last rotation of doctors had already gone through. Unless he pushed that button, or there was an emergency, nobody would supposedly check on this room until the next morning. He would probably get into huge trouble for this if his and everyone else's gut feeling was wrong here. However, he was more than willing to risk it in this case. Once he was sure that enough time had passed that nobody would come back into the room because they had forgotten anything, he reached his hand out for the chain binding him. Once again, his organic arm had been the one that was secured to the bed, since both of his guards had such a deep aversion to touching his mechanical right appendage, that they avoided doing so even at the cost of leaving his potentially more dangerous arm free to move. Then again, it wasn't like securing it would have done them much good here. Locking his mechanical fingers tightly around the shackle that was clasped around the sturdy bed frame, he began to slowly turn his hand. The prosthetic joints of the robotic appendage were much more flexible than organic ones, and the many fibers of synthetic muscles that were making up most of its mass were easily able to generate quite extreme forces in minimal movements, even without any engagement from the rest of his body. He could feel and hear the shackle's material strain against the movements, as he slowly but surely increased the pressure his arm was putting out more and more. As he did so, he was already thinking about possible excuses he could make in the morning, should this all turn out to be a dud. Maybe he had tried to call someone to allow him to go to the bathroom, but nobody had reacted when he pressed the button. It was unbelievable, but hey, it was better than nothing. With a sudden snap, the manacled shackle broke out of its holding, causing the entire thing to open and set his organic arm free, though the one around his wrist itself would probably have to remain if he didn't want to break his bone in an attempt to open it the same way as he had the other. Still, this was enough freedom of movement for him. He wrapped the rest of the chain around his arm so it wouldn't get in the way. Then, he quickly jumped off the bed. Nia still wasn't breathing on her own, and therefore he couldn't move her away from the life-saving machines that she was attached to. But luckily, those machines, as well as the bed itself, all came equipped with wheels for ease of movement, as long as one unlocked the brakes that currently held them securely in place. The things may have been big, but the gravity was low, and James was adequately strong and had a good bit of mass to throw around, meaning that with some effort and sweat, he was able to move everything to the other side of the room easily enough. It was a bit awkward to leave the device's cables to stretch all the way across the room. However, James was just glad that they were long enough to allow for the movement at that time. Admittedly, he felt a little bit silly as he rolled everything around like that. Constantly he had to think, what if nothing is going to happen at all? He would have carted his deathly injured sister and her medical lifelines around like a madman for nothing. But still, the other possibility was so much worse than just feeling a bit stupid and getting in legal trouble. He wondered if there were any cameras watching him right now. There had to be, right? Was anybody keeping watch on them? Or would this just be a video that would be discovered later? So far, nobody had come to stop and re-detain him at least. As his gaze wandered around, it eventually fell onto the floor. Unlike the shackles, there was no way he would be able to get that open without help. That much had been thoroughly proven. However, as long as it would stay closed, he didn't have any problem. There would only be an issue if it opened at the wrong time. He swallowed, heavily. Then he climbed up onto Nia's bed for just a second. Leaning over her, he pressed a long, tender kiss onto her forehead, before giving her one last worried look. Right after, he jumped back off the bed and took up a position right next to the door. He pressed himself closely against the wall, so he could only be seen when somebody already leaned a good part of their body inside. Standing like that, he kept a tight watch on the door while also lifting his phone up to his face. "Ready," he announced, once he had unmuted the call that had already been running for quite a while. "Same here." Tu was the first to reply. "Just waiting for it." Sam soon joined in. "Be careful, everyone," Andrzej warned in a hushed tone. "Don't have to tell me," Admir chimed in. "I'm keeping a lookout," Konglosh confirmed. "Let's hope this is worth the trouble," Sheeta commented aloud. "I'll take trouble over dying," Coco retorted, before taking on a more commanding tone. "Alright, everyone. Radio silence unless something actually happens, alright? I don't want any chatting to distract us from possible movement." Everyone quickly confirmed the commander's orders before everything fell quiet. It was a pressing silence, a consuming one. Nobody made so much as a peep, as they all quietly waited for some sort of dangerous event that would probably never come. However, if it did, their chances weren't good as it was, and so they had decided to be safe rather than sorry. Though, honestly, even if it would mean facing the fallout of having broken his restraints, James hoped with every bone in his body that everything would be fine. Because he was the only one who could effectively free himself from the shackles, he obviously also had to be the one who would watch over Nia, as anyone else would have literally had their hands tied. However, him being here would also mean that Sheeta would have to face any possible attack entirely alone. He tried to find comfort in the thought that the entire idea of them being attacked was quite far-fetched, but after putting their heads together with command, it was the worst-case scenario that they had come up with. And since preparing for the worst case would mean they would be the safest, that was what they did. The idea was the following. By going through James and the UHSDF in his effort to get the remaining rogue Miette arrested, Alexander was trying to engineer a situation in which they would all be in the same place at the same time, while both parties were also aware of the other's presence without question. Then, since both sides technically had access to the necessary means to break through the local cybersecurity, as previously proven, a big prison break would be staged that would ultimately look like one of the sides had tried to take out the other in the process, or maybe that both sides had wiped each other out. The door would be open, all cameras would be out, and the prisoners would ideally be taken by surprise in their sleep. Far-fetched indeed. James couldn't help but chuckle to himself, or more likely he didn't want to help himself, because chuckling at the absurdity was much better than getting lost in it. Because although he told himself it was absurd to soothe them, his nerves were as tense as the string of a bow while he watched that door, not even feeling how the hours of the night went by. Although he constantly told himself how unlikely it was, he kept his eyes fixed on that door, even as the entire facility slowly fell asleep around him. If it opened, he was ready to end whatever would be trying to come in unannounced in the blink of an eye, if he had to. He just waited for it to open. However, as minutes turned to hours and hours turned to the entire night, the door did not open. It remained perfectly closed. And eventually, he could hear the sounds of life returning to the facility around him. After he had heard the first few rounds of guards patrol outside, he glanced down at his phone. It was close to the 3rd hour of the day. Nia's doctors would be here any moment for their morning rounds. And James breathed a sigh of relief. It's not paranoia if someone is after you, but sometimes a far-fetched idea still turned out to be just that.